Okay, so our player is moving around and they can get a key and you can go to the next level, and whenever you pick up the key it interacts with this and makes that fill up. But what about when we run into enemies? We need some sort of damage indicator. They need to hurt us, and when they hurt us we need our health to reflect that on our heads up display. So that's what we're going to focus on right now. We're going to build our health system and make that work correctly. So basically what we're going to start with is we're going to go to our player, go to your player, and then add another variable in there and call it health. So we're adding that variable, and it is going to be an integer, and I believe an integer is a whole number, not a decimal. I think that's the difference between the two. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Maybe you can help me. So now that we have that health integer figured out, we've got that the player has 3 health. Now we need that to reflect when we go to the heads up display. When we take damage, we want it to load properly. So go ahead and load your heads up display scene. And when you go to your heads up display scene, what you're going to do is you're going to go to row, and you're going to add a flow machine. And in this flow machine, it is going to be embedded, not a macro. And I've only seen this so far in a heads up display. Maybe it's super common. But basically what an embedded state machine does is that it's only going to run in this object. You're never going to use this macro anywhere else. It's always going to be here. So maybe you can help me again on that, to where you can explain that, where you would use this anywhere else than a heads up display. Maybe you used it commonly. You might run into this a lot. You need to know how to do the difference, but this one is going to be embedded. So what we're going to do is delete the start event, start with the update event, and then we're going to drag it to a what's called a for each loop. Now, the way that I understand this is going to say, I want you to loop this, what we're about to set up here in just a second. I want you to check, and every time you check that, I want you to do something. So the for each loop, what this is going to be is you're going to set up a list of game objects, and under that list of game objects, again, we set this up on row, and this is going to update every frame. We're going to check for these three game objects. So we want to check for heart 1. I want you to check for heart 2. And I want you to check for heart 3. Do this. And every time you do this, for every time you go through this loop of checking for these objects, then I want you to do something. What do I want you to do? Well, I want you to set the sprite for those objects. And it's an item. You're going to set the item to from those things are going to have their sprites set. Now, what are we going to set them to? Well, here we're going to see a kind of a branch here, or a select, because it's kind of more complicated than just setting true or false output. It's true or false input, right? We're going to go backwards. The index needs to be greater, so let's do a greater here, and the way this is going to work, that is actually needs to go to B instead of A, else it would be less than. Alright, so we're going to set that to B, so right click that, change that to B, and on the A, what we're going to do is we're going to get variable, get object variable. What object variable are we looking for? We want to look at the health of the player. So get variable application. Remember, we set up that singleton principle for the player. So check player. Now, just a second ago, I had to redo this whole video because I messed up here, and it took me a minute to figure out what I did wrong. I put a space after player. If you put a space after player or health or before, it's not going to check it correctly. It can't find it. It has to be, it's case sensitive. It has to be exactly the way it is in the object and application variables. Okay, so here's the object variable health. Here's the application variable player. So go check the player's health. If the player's health, A, is greater than B. What's B? The index. The index is information from these objects. So there's 3 of those objects. And the way that scripting works is there's 3 objects, but it's 0, 1, 2, not 1, 2, 3. I don't know why they set it up that way, but apparently there is a reason. I just don't know what it is. Maybe you can help me there. You need to help me a lot, don't you? So when that is greater, when A is greater than B, which we're going to do something now. If it is, then I want you to do a sprite. Remember, we're changing the sprite. We're going to set the sprite. What are we setting it to? Well, when A is greater than B, we're going to set it to heart full. HUD heart full. That's right up there, HUD heart full. And it's going to do this every time it loops. Every frame, it's going to check. Well, what's the health? Well, the health is 3. Well, then we're going to have 3 hearts. If it is false, we're going to set it to, whoops, I'm trying to type in the thing, sprite, literal. We're going to set that to HUD heart empty. Oh, dang it, not key empty, heart empty. Heart, there we go, right there, HUD heart empty. So that is going to set the heart to do that. So basically, when when this object is checking the singleton principle of the player application on that unit, when it sees that the health of that unit is 3, then it's going to give you 3 hearts. If it's 2, it's going to give you 2 full hearts and 1 empty heart. If it's, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So when we test our game now, this should work correctly. So let's save that. Let's go back to level 1. And again, remember, go level 1. I forgot to do something just a second ago. If I go to level 2, it's not going to work because I didn't do this. I set a variable on my player, and notice it's bold because there's been a change and I haven't updated it. It's saying, hey, update me. Apply that to all your player units across every level. Now, whenever we go into level 1, you should have the ability to check and see your hearts. We don't have enemies yet, but now we can play with that value, that integer value. Now when I type in 2, you should see 2 full hearts and 1 empty one. This is exactly what you see. 1. Okay, now 0, 3. Okay, so it works. That's working correctly. Now we need to create the health state machine. So we need our health to reflect correctly whenever we take damage, and this is going to be our first state machine. Okay, so this next part of this video tutorial, we are going to have to set up a state machine. It's going to be the first one that we've dealt with. We're not going to be able to check this until we get to the enemies, so we want to make sure that we get this right and follow this carefully. But basically, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that when the player takes damage from an enemy, that they don't just die automatically, that every time the frame updates that it's going to kill them. We want a vulnerable stage where they can take damage, and we want kind of like a slight delay before they can take damage again. So that way it's giving me a little bit of time to get away from that enemy, and I can get into trouble again if I get too close after a second or two. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up what's called a state machine, in that we need 2 different states for this character. We need a vulnerable state and we need an invulnerable state. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our player object, and we are going to set up a state machine. And this state machine is going to give us a new macro. So we're going to go to the new macro, but we want it to be a state macro. So that macro, we're going to call this player health. We want to know when the player is taking damage. Now, when you see there is you get this start with the on state enter, on state exit, an update on that start unit that it just created. So what we're going to do is we're going to rename this to vulnerable. So right over here in the graph inspector, you see summary. Just call that vulnerable. Did I spell that right? No, I didn't. Vulnerable. There we go. So now, oh, you know what? I think I messed that up. I did. Need to start vulnerable. And under summary, we're going to say can be hurt and killed. So there's vulnerable, and then we're going to need an invulnerable state. So when you see that, you finish that, that's what it's going to show you. What we want to do is implement a damage mechanic. So when we take damage, it's going to do something. And the way that we're going to do this is that when we go into the vulnerable stage, we're going to see these three objects. We're just going to grab all three of those and delete them. And then we're going to do a custom event. So we want to do custom event. And in that custom event, we're going to give it one argument. And what you do there is you see it do something. So we're going to tell it to do something. Now, I want you to check yourself, and we're going to do a damage string on that. So we're creating something called damage inside that player state machine. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell it to set the variable, and it's going to be an object variable. Remember, this player has a lot of variables here. We want to set the health variable on that. And this is going to be kind of complicated on how exactly we're going to do this. Let's come over here real quick, and we're going to do a get variable. We're going to get the object variable, health. It's different from set. If we're getting it, we want to know what that number is. And we're going to subtract it from the current player health. So let's subtract that. Come on. Subtract. There. Got it. Got it working. Okay, we're going to subtract B from A. B is this right up here. So, hey, I'm going to add damage to that. So we're going to subtract damage from our health, and we're going to give it a maximum input. So type in input, and I believe that you should get a maximum there. Let's see if I can find that. Maximum. It's just maximum. Just type in maximum, you'll find it. Maximum of 2 float literal of 0. Again, that's where that that variable, you remember that variable starts at 0 and it goes to a maximum of 2, so it's 0, 1, 2, and then we're going to set the health. So what this is doing is saying, hey, when you take damage, we want this event to happen. We want to get the health, and we want to subtract one portion of health from that. So let's name this, hold control and select this group. Ah, dang it. It's so frustrating sometimes. Ugh, whatever. Anyway, okay, so control, select, subtract damage from health. There we go. All right, and I think this is a negative effect, so I'm just gonna make this red because it makes sense to me. When I'm looking for that later, if I need that, I can find that. All right, so after updating the health variable, so when we do this, we want to change that. If it reaches 0, we want to make sure that the player dies. So if not, we want to just have a hurt animation in the animator. So we want it to be like, whenever it gets hurt. And they actually have a sprite set up for that in the animator. So what we're going to do is we're going to select this variable. We're going to branch it off here because there's going to be a true and false statement here. So branch going to make it false equal. I'm kind of working backwards here. I'm looking at a graph. You see that graph on the tutorial web page. Again, I showed you where that is. That's what I'm looking at and how I'm doing this. But I'm trying to explain how this works. So, if the player health is equal to 0, then I want you to do something. This is what I want you to do. If it's true, I want you to do a custom trigger. Trigger, custom event. And what I want you to do, I want you to do death. Right? If it's false, if it's not 0, then all I want you to do is I want you to play a hurt animation. So set trigger, trigger for that animator. And under the animation, or the animator, there again is another option here of hurt. So what we're going to do is we're going to call that in this graph. So we're going to call the hurt trigger. And we're going to do trigger arguments. Trigger event. Trigger custom event. Sorry. Trigger custom event. And the arguments are going to be 0. And we're just going to do hurt. So make the hurt happen. So, again, we don't have anything set for hurt yet, I don't think. We might have to go in and find that. I'll come back to that. I'll circle back. All right, so this object right here is checking for 0 hearts or 0 health. Let's do 0 health. Is the player dead? If it has 0 health, then what we're going to need to do is we need to trigger this death animation. What happens when you hit the death animation is we want you to reload the level. Oh, goodness gracious. Oh, man, that was really small. I didn't like that. Okay, let's try that. Ah, there we go. I grabbed it. Nice. All right, so this is we're gonna make you die. Maybe. You know what? Dang it. Just delete it. Start over. Goodness, man, this is frustrating. Sometimes you get in these things and they're just, it seems just in the embedded ones. Like, the embedded ones just bug out on me real bad. And maybe you don't have that effect, but it does have that effect on me. So we're going to set a hurt animation if it's dead. Ugh. I'll resize it. There we go. Maybe. I don't. Are you having that problem whenever you do yours in embed? For some reason, mine does that. Okay, again, this is animation, and I think animation should be purple. Black, this is checking for something, so I'm going to make this yellow because that makes sense to me for some stupid reason. And death is always black. So, again, we had a death animation inside the player controller. If you remember that, you can go back and look at that. Right now we're in the state machine, but if you go back and look at the flow machine prefab, ooh, I forgot to do something, I think. Where did I put that flow machine? Did I do that anywhere? Ooh, where did I do that? I think I might have made a... No, never mind. We're good. This little thing. So let's go to prefabs. Nope. Sorry. Let's go to macros. And under our player controller, remember we had a death animation. And every time this happens, every time you go to death, it's going to load the scene. So basically what that's doing is when you get to 0 hearts, what I want you to do is I want you to trigger the death animation. If not, I want you to, or not death animation, death event. Just trigger that death event. And if you're not dead, well then I want you to trigger this hurt animation. So that's in the vulnerable state. Now we're going to do the invulnerable state. So go back to your player health macro, which is your state flow. Am I saying that right? I don't think I'm saying that right. What is that thing called? State machine. Excuse me. State machine. Go back to your flow state machine. Go back to your player health state machine, and you'll see this vulnerable, and then we're going to create a new flow state, and we're going to call that invulnerable. So, and under invulnerable, what we're going to do is sing player cannot be hurt while active. That's just kind of giving you an idea or an understanding on what that does. Now, what we need to do, this is a lot like the animator. If you've ever messed with the animator, you know how you can grab the animator and you say, hey, I'm going to make a transition from this to that. The same thing is happening here. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a transition from vulnerable to invulnerable and make another transition from invulnerable back to vulnerable. What that's doing is that when these events happen, which we'll get into in just a second, it's going to trigger from the vulnerable state to the invulnerable state, and from the invulnerable state back to the vulnerable state. So we'll get to that in just a second. We just need to understand that the trigger is what makes these things switch back and forth. So what we're going to do first is, if you notice they're yellow, it's because they're not set up to where they're working properly, and it's dimmed out because it's not active. What we're going to do is we're going to first open the from vulnerable to invulnerable. So we need the arrow going this way. This might be backwards on your screen. We're going to do that, and we're going to open it up. So double click it, and we're going to do a custom event. Custom event. So when this custom event happens, which is the hurt event, so we made that just a second ago. When that happens, I want you to trigger this transition, right? So trigger, go, when you get hurt, when this hurt custom event happens, go to invulnerable. But we don't want to stay there forever, because invulnerable right at this moment doesn't do anything. By the way, it's saying if you will take that, select that, and name it hurt. I guess if you need to check that later on, that's helpful. And going back, we need it to be something. We need a short delay. So let's open that one up, and we'll go back and look. So we have that same thing, trigger transition. So when this enters on enter state, when this happens, when you go back through the other way, I want you to wait. So type in wait, and you're looking wait for seconds for 1 second, and then I want you to go back. Now, there's a part here, it's called a coroutine. I didn't know what this was, so I had to go look up the dictionary, because again, I'm trying to retain this information so that I can teach it to somebody else. If there isn't something that I know, either I'll give up looking for it and say, hey, can you explain it to me, or I'm trying to understand. Basically, if you don't have, when you have on-state enter, if you don't have coroutine selected, from what I understand, it will make it to where it's not repeatable. If you want something to wait for a little bit of portion of time, and you don't have that selected, it will let you get hurt one time, but then it won't ever do it again. So you have to have coroutine selected. If you look over here, it says, run this event as in a coroutine enabling asynchronous flow like wait units. So anytime you have a wait, you have to have it set as a coroutine. That's the way I understand it. I went and read about it. Again, sometimes programming language is kind of frustrating, but I don't know. That is what it is. So what we're going to have to do now is, if you remember when we set up our layers, we're going to have to make it to where when our enemy interacts with our player, there's a little trick that you can do to make it go back to invulnerable. And the way that you do that is by going to Edit, Project Settings, go to your Physics 2D, and remember these layers here? I had you add in the player invincible. If you hadn't done it, it would have made you do it right now. Now, our player needs to interact with enemies, and I think enemies is too far down the line. That might have to be fixed. Oh, player enemies, player, enemies. Okay, right there. So that our player will interact with our enemies, and it will still get hurt. But the projectiles, so we already set this up earlier. Our enemies do not need to interact with anything that's on the player invincible layer. So what's going to happen is we're going to set the player layer from player to player invincible to ensure that it has some invulnerability at that particular moment. So enemies don't need to interact with other enemies. Player can interact with other players. So if you can set your layers up, I'm looking at their screen right here, which if you kind of look, again, I'm following along with what they're doing here. That's the way it looks. So if you can ensure that your screen looks like their screen there, it should be set up correctly. But make sure you're in Physics 2D. I set that up incorrectly, and I was having all kinds of problems before I figured that out. So now we need the other aspect set up that we need to, when we enter the invulnerable state, we need the player layer to change. So go ahead and double click the invulnerable state, and what we're going to do here is we are going to, I believe we're going to delete the update, but we're going to leave the other two. So on enter state, what we need to happen is we're going to set layer, set layer, game object layer, to name to layer. We're going to set it to player invincible. Make sure that's case sensitive. Make sure you spell that correctly. On exit, so when you come into this state, set your player layer to 1 second. I'm sorry, set your player layer to player invincible. We have it set to, it will wait 1 second before it exits the state. And then we will change, again, when we leave the exit, when we leave the state, we're going to set the layer on yourself to layer name to layer, set it back to player. So essentially what this is doing is it's saying we're going to take that player and we're going to push them into the layer player invincible. And if you remember from our layer thing here, our transition, this is going to wait 1 second as a coroutine. It's going to wait 1 second, and then it's going to switch the player on exit state back to player, so then they can be hurt again. That's just a little trick on how they get damage to your player. Now again, we're not going to be able to check this until we set up our enemies, but that should be coming up very soon in just a second. That was kind of a long video, but there's a lot to that, setting up a state machine. And as we start getting into enemies, you might want to go take a little break. Okay, so pause the video as we start this next one, or wait, because this next one is going to be a long, complicated, convoluted subject when you start getting into enemies and damage and AI. Okay, so let's check it out next video.